each state has different rules on Medicaid. So if you're doing research, looking something up in California doesn't necessarily apply here in Texas. Yeah, you just got to be real careful with where you get your information. Like, we're not talking about, mom needs care today. When you go on an airplane, they tell you if the mask comes down, you put your mask on yourself before you help the others around you. I think probably if you're a young couple, get your estate planning done.
Do you think money takes up more life space than it should? On this show, we discuss with and share stories from artists, authors, entrepreneurs, and advisors about how they mindfully minimize the time and energy spent thinking about money. Join your host, Jonathan Dio, and learn how to put money in its place and get more out of life.
Hey, welcome back. On this episode of the Mindful Money Podcast, I'm chatting with Aaron Miller. Aaron is an award-winning elder law and estate planning attorney dedicated to helping families with long-term care. After starting his career in corporate litigation, which we'll talk about a bit, he shifted his focus to avoid the high cost of long-term care inspired by his grandparents' struggles. We love those stories here, family stories. So Miller Law Office has been named the best law firm in Plano, Texas for 3 consecutive years, known for building strong relationships and providing services like Medicaid planning and family harmony protection. Those of us in California will reference Medicaid as Medi-Cal. He won't be up on all the details of that. It's a different state, but the general planning stuff we'll talk about. I wanted to have him on the podcast to have a candid conversation about elder care planning. Everyone in my industry talks about those core 4 documents about estate planning. And Aaron is a trust attorney. They do the 4 core documents, among other things. But I wanted to have him on the podcast specifically to provide our listeners some insight into what they can do to take care of their elders or take care of themselves as they age. Aaron, welcome to the Mindful Money Podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate you having me today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Sweet. I'm looking forward to it as well. So first, tell everyone where you call home, where you're calling in from. Just tell us about yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I currently live near Plano, Texas. That's where my office is. I've been living in Texas since the 2nd grade, but migrated down south from Alaska, Washington State, and Colorado when I was little bitty. Dad chased jobs, I guess. But grew up in Fort Worth, basically. Went to UT undergrad, Baylor Law School, and have been a lawyer since 2002.
Wow. And so you grew up, you said Alaska, Washington State, Colorado. That's the first 2 years of your life. You don't have memories from there.
I remember Alaska, a couple things I remember. I remember yellow snow because we had a dog. I remember leaving Alaska on the airplane. So when we were on the plane, my mother, it was a very, very small plane. We flew from Valdez, I think, to Anchorage. My mother couldn't sit with me. She sat with my sister in the back. So I was by myself, which was traumatizing to a 2.5, 3-year-old. But I remember dropping a penny out of my pocket and then looking out the window and seeing, I guess, a floater or something. It looked like I could see it falling all the way down, and saw the inlet there, the ocean and the glaciers and stuff like that. So that's kind of all I remember from Alaska. But yeah, I was about 2.5 or 3 when we left.
Probably the most important lesson we'll talk about today is do not eat the yellow snow.
That is very true. That is very true. That's something, thankfully, I did not learn the hard way. So,
So did you fly out of Alaska into Fort Worth, and you grew up in Fort Worth?
We went to Washington State for a bit. I was actually in Washington State when Mount St. Helens blew the first time. We lived in, I think it was Spokane at the time. Okay. And I remember we had to wear a mask. I think, if I remember right, anywhere, inside or outside, for the first 3 days. And then anytime we went outside for the week after, we had to wear a mask because of the ash. And for a long time, we had a mayonnaise jar full of ash that my mother scooped up over the back porch.
Wow.
And that's been since lost in the moves. But yeah. So then we went to Colorado. My dad worked for a friend of his, and then we moved to Fort Worth. And that's essentially where I grew up.
I'm trying to get a sense of like where, we learn money lessons at the knees of our parents and grandparents. So when we're very, very young, we don't realize we're learning lessons at that point. So I'm wondering, as you grew up, many states, what kind of lessons did you learn, or did your parents teach you about money or even entrepreneurship as a kid or teen even?
Yeah. So my dad had a lot of jobs. Sometimes he was an employee. Sometimes he owned a business. And a lot of his advice depended on his status at the moment. So when I was older, he owned a print shop with a friend of his, and I worked for him. And at that time, his philosophy was, you can sleep when you're dead, which is basically you just keep working until you can't do it anymore. Other times it was relax a little bit. The stories in our family around money was money doesn't grow on trees. You have to be very, very frugal with it and be careful with it. I didn't get a whole lot of like budget instruction teachings because they just really didn't know about it. One of the coolest things I remember actually about money was when I was a kid, my mother went back to college to get a degree. And when she graduated and she got her first real job afterwards, what they did was they took the difference in her previous paycheck and the new paycheck, and we kind of split it up. And that was money that we all each got to spend. And I can't remember what I spent mine on, but I remember that was an opportunity. So I thought that was
the first paycheck or
the first paycheck. Yeah, that was kind of like a reward for, mom had to go do studying or something like that. So she couldn't be there to cook dinner for a few years or for once in a while. So it was kind of like we were all participating in her education.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had a sense of, besides the, potential workaholism of, work until you die. If you had a sense of when your dad was working for a company versus had his own business, if there was a different sense of comfort around money with those two things, or if you have any memory of that.
Yeah, for me, they pretty much shielded me from it. We didn't have a whole lot of discussions about it other than my mother was very frugal. My dad used to say, you give her a penny and she'd make Abe Lincoln scream. One of the first stories that I heard was she first started clipping coupons when we lived in Washington State. And my dad kind of poo-pooed it for a while until she saved enough money to buy him a pair of work boots. I think he was a welder or something at the time. And so he always gave her a little bit of a hard time that his shoes pinched a little bit. But I think that was kind of eye-opening for him. And so for a long time, one of my jobs was after church. We didn't subscribe to the newspaper, but we would go and buy one from the vending machine, basically. So my job would, after church, be walk around the corner, go buy a couple of newspapers for the coupons every week. And so, and then we would go and clip those and, shop the coupons all the time.
I've never asked this question, but I have this experience myself of clipping coupons with my mom. Have you, as an adult, do you have a feeling about using coupons?
I think they're great. If I see one in the store, I'll pick one up, but I don't necessarily go out of my way now to get the newspaper. I mean, I just don't even buy a newspaper anymore. So, but yeah, I think that I have no shame about them. I think they're great. I just don't spend the time to go do it anymore because it was like a full-time job for her. I mean, she would spend 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday, clipping them out, organizing them, and preparing her shopping for the week. And what we ate that week largely depended on what was on sale.
Yep, us too. I actually take that into my adulthood, and I think about, I don't do it. I have a lot of shame about it. I feel embarrassed about it, and I felt embarrassed as a kid, and I've carried that into my adulthood. And I've worked through lots of it. It hung on, this idea of scarcity, this idea of not having enough. That doesn't seem to have affected you, so that's good.
No, I mean, I definitely get that. I definitely understand it. Mine was different. I remember we didn't have a lot of like designer clothes or real fashionable things. In fact, my mother would make our clothes for a long time until I got finally old enough to kvetch loud enough. I guess she decided we'd go buy some. But very, very, very frugal lady.
Great lessons.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I want to get into elder law. Before we do, can you kind of tell the Mindful Money audience your path? Like, how did you get to there? You did some corporate law. How did you get to being a estate planning attorney?
Yeah. So I went to law school a few years after I graduated from undergrad. I actually worked for a business in Austin for a few years, and it just wasn't mentally satisfying. Actually, I went to undergrad with the idea I wanted to go to law school, but by the time I graduated, there was a real glut of attorneys. I guess there still is, but at the time it was just really, really high, and it was hard for people to find jobs. So I got a different job, and then about 2 or 3 years into that, I was just not being fulfilled. I needed something more, and decided to try law school. Took the LSAT, did pretty well on that, got accepted to a lot of law schools. I chose Baylor because there's a lot of collegiality among Baylor lawyers. It's a good school. It trains you how to be a litigation attorney. And so after that, I was a clerk for the Texas Supreme Court for a year. Loved that job until I started doing elder law. That was my favorite job. It's one of the few courts in the country that will let their law clerks listen to their deliberations. So I could go in and look at a case and go, oh yeah, that's going to be 5-4, that's going to be 9-0, 7-3 or whatever, just because I knew the personalities involved and knew how they looked at things. And that lasted for about 2 or 3 years afterwards. But Loved that job. Went and worked for a large international law firm in the Dallas office of the large international law firm. Realized they weren't making partners of that office, so went to a small litigation boutique. We had a difference of philosophy on how litigation should go. And so I went out on my own. Originally was doing litigation and realized one day I loved being in the courtroom. I love talking with juries and preparing, doing the cross examinations and doing the opening and closings. But I hated all the chest thumping, trying to threaten you. I'm so tough. I'm going to beat you up in court. And it hardly ever went to trial. And I had really had a crisis of conscience, I guess, the day that I realized I was excited that I ruined somebody's Christmas because there was some documentation I sent to the opposing counsel. When I did the numbers, I realized it was going to be due the day after Christmas. So they were going to be working over Christmas break. And because of different rules, I couldn't extend it. And I was like really excited. I was like, ha, I got one. And then I got to thinking about it. I was like, I don't like being that person. That really shook who I was. And I realized I'd been a really angry and bitter person because I don't like being wrong about things. And the whole thing about litigation is, no, you're wrong about this. And I was taking it out on my wife, taking it out on my kids because I couldn't turn it off when I went home every day. So got super disgusted, realized that I couldn't keep doing what I was doing and decided to change everything. I didn't know what I was going to do, looked at different things, and eventually found a program that helped people who are doing trial work go into estate planning. And I first started doing estate planning for families with young kids, which I really am passionate about, I really love. But what I really, really fell in love with was elder law. Estate planning answers the question, what happens if you get sick and die? Elder law answers the question of what happens if you get sick and don't die? How are you going to pay for care? How are you going to get taken care of? One of the things I always loved when I was a kid was we'd go visit my grandparents. They lived in Mesa, Arizona, at least during the winter months. And for Christmas, we would always go and visit the old folks' home. I'd recite Bible verses. We would sing Christmas carols. And what I really loved was listening to their stories, listening to the wisdom that they've accumulated in their life. Just loved listening to them talk. And when I was looking at what I wanted to do, and as I got more and more into it, I realized that there are so many people taking advantage of our seniors. There's so much bad advice out there. And my family has been affected, right? So I realized this was a huge opportunity to help people and make a real difference in their lives. I used to tell people when I was at the big law firm, I made the world safe for the big 5 accounting firms. But now I can look at the people that I've helped, the families that I've helped over the last, since I started doing estate planning in 2009. It's just been really amazing to me. I really am grateful to the families that have let me help them.
Yeah. So when you talk about what happens if you get sick and you don't die, are we talking about physically or financially or both?
Mainly financially, yeah. But physically too. I mean, there's different options that you have, whether you stay at home, whether you go to, long-term care facility or independent living or full-on nursing home or.
You talk about 6 options, right? I think you referenced somewhere on your website, there's 6 options.
You've got at-home care, you've got residential care homes, which are a newer thing. I think they were pioneered out in California, but you drive past them in a neighborhood, you wouldn't know what they are, but they're really cool because they're like a facility in that they have caregivers on staff 24 hours, but it's a smaller community. So you might have 6 residents in a place. A lot of times they're a lot more cost effective than maybe going to a different place. And it also depends on kind of what they can provide. But residential care homes are great. You have independent living that sometimes can give some sort of care if you need it, at least to a certain point. Of course, you have assisted livings, you have nursing homes, and then there's LTACs if you get sick and you need long-term acute care is what that stands for. They're kind of like a mix between a nursing home and a hospital.
Rehab?
It's different necessarily than rehab. I think it's more intensive care. Like you don't really need to go on full on nursing home, but maybe you have like an open wound that needs to be cared for more so than in a nursing home. It's not super common, but in the larger areas, they're there.
Who makes the elder? I mean, do I make my own elder care plan or do I wait and then my kids make my elder care plan for me? Like what's the process?
Yeah, you can do both, right? So people, you can do your own planning while you're vertical. or somebody else can do their planning while you're horizontal. Either way, it'll be done. But if you're
Which way is
vertical,
better?
yeah. I mean, I personally think it's better to do it ahead of time. You get to decide how things are done, as opposed to if you just leave it up to your kids. They're going to make the decisions. They may not be the decisions that you would have wanted to make, and frankly, they may not want to make those decisions. So, yeah, there's different ways to plan, pre-planning or after the fact. And to me, it's always better before.
Yeah. You talk about this idea of balancing. It's horrible, but a loved one's like dementia diagnosis and their autonomy. Like, how do you even do that? My assumption has always been, oh, you have dementia. We're now basically controlling. You can't drive. You can't, there's a whole list of things you can't do anymore. But how do you balance that so they feel more autonomous?
So my mother had dementia, and she knew it was coming, and it was awful. It was awful because one of the things she said was, I don't want to be a blithering idiot. That was her term. This lady was a member of Mensa and had a math degree and just used her brain her entire life. And to have that taken away from her was devastating to her and to us to watch.
Yeah.
To me, I don't know, is it worse for the person that has it or the worse for the family? Because the person that has it, they see it coming, but at some point it doesn't register to them anymore. But the family knows what they were like, and it's almost like a living death because they're not alive anymore. So for us, when my mother retired from the state of Alaska, she was about 63, 64 years old, and she had an opportunity to get long-term care insurance for like $200 a month. And my mom and the dad said, we really can't afford it right now, so they didn't do it. Well, by the time she was 67, she started having memory issues. They had moved back to Alaska maybe 10 or 15 years earlier. And around March or so in Fairbanks, Alaska, my mother got locked out of the house. And my dad had put a lock on the door, and he put a sign that says the code is the year you were born. She couldn't remember it.
Oh.
So thankfully, the neighbors saw her and rescued her, but it could have been tragic. Fairbanks in February is not a pleasant time. And so we made a decision as a family to move her down. She went to live with my sister. And my dad stayed in Alaska for a little bit. He kind of wrapped things up and moved down about 3 or 4 months later. But she was good for a while. She participated in the family. She lived with my sister in Austin. And things were pretty good at first, but my sister's kids were young, and sometimes they'd play and they get loud, and she didn't like that and would get mad. Sometimes she'd just get mad for other reasons, and she started hitting my sister. And we started doing that. We realized we got to do something else. And that's when we started looking at long-term care. We started looking at assisted living.
What's the process of finding a really good sort of facility? Because I'm assuming that's where you go with that.
What I did was there are websites. The CMS, I think it's Center for Medicaid Services, have a website, and they do ratings of assisted livings, nursing homes, that kind of thing, based on their inspections and things like that. So that's one way to look at. And we just went and toured probably at least half a dozen places. And, one place we went, they had memory care, but when we got there, we went down into basically a basement. And when we got there, it was so dark. The residents I think they were pretty heavily medicated, and they were just kind of laying all over the couches, not doing a whole lot. And that was, to us, the worst possible scenario for her. Other places were great. They had activities for people to do, just depending on your ability to do them. And so that's what we put her as a place. It was not a close drive. We were hoping for a place closer. They just didn't have any availability, but it was about a 25-minute, 30-minute drive from my sister. But it made all the difference in the world because my mother actually was happier there because she didn't have the little kids running around making a lot of noise, and she made some friends. In fact, they told us that she would wander into her friends' rooms and they just hang out and chat for a while, and they'd find, sometimes she'd fall asleep there. But
I'm wondering if your own experience, did that inform how you go about working with clients in this process?
Oh, absolutely. I've always had compassion for my clients, for the kids that are going through this process. It really just brought it home to another level. When you have a family member that you're helping go through this, I know this is the most stressful time in your life because there can be a lot of guilt associated with that. I know my mother, she hated doctors, hated the idea of having to go to the hospital, and really 10 years earlier would have hated the fact that she was in an assisted living or memory care. But we knew that that was the best thing for her. And I know my sister particularly, she felt a lot of guilt because of it, but there really wasn't much choice. But for us, I felt like, but yeah, it's a hard thing for people to do.
Did you and your sister disagree? Did you have disagreements on things, or did you work all that out, or how did
No,
that?
we pretty much agreed. I mean, my dad was there too. He pretty much turned it over to us because he couldn't take care of her. I mean, he was taking care of her back in Alaska, but he had to go to work, and so she would be by herself, which is one of the reasons why we brought her down. She just felt like she should do more. It's interesting. What I found is it's usually the oldest daughter that takes care of mom or dad, and if there's not an older daughter, it's usually the oldest daughter-in-law that does it. Not always, but most of the time. That seems to be where it goes.
I want to talk about the financial aspects here a little bit. So what happens to our assets when we get sick?
It depends on how you've set things up, right?
Mm.
So there are three ways to pay for long-term care. You can pay for it yourself out of pocket. You can get some form of long-term care insurance, or you can have the government help pay for care. Out of pocket is going to give you the most options, depending on what you can afford, right? If you got the money, you can pay for it. Most people can't, or they can't do it for very long. That was the option that my grandfather chose, but not because he knew he had options. When I was a kid, my grandmother got sick. We actually happened to be visiting one day. They lived in Montrose, Colorado. They were farmers their whole lives. And we were there. And the last night before we were supposed to leave, my grandmother had a heart attack. And my dad held her in his arms and thought he had lost her. She went to the hospital, and this was back before, you have a heart attack, you're in and out in 3 days. She was there for like 3 or 4 weeks. I don't remember exactly, but she came home and she was fine at first. But then she started developing some memory issues herself. And so she would do things like put her slippers in the freezer, or she undid the heating air return vent and put her purse down in there, or put her keys behind some books in a bookcase. And so eventually it got so bad that my dad got a call one day from my grandfather, and he said that he had to put her in a home. And that's where she spent the next 10 years of her life. And because no one talked to her about the different options, he had to go and pay out of pocket. So every month he'd go and write a check or give him some cash or whatever. And basically what happened was he lost all of his savings.
Yeah.
About 3 years after she passed, he had some health issues. At the time, my dad still lived in Fort Worth. My uncle lived in Arlington, which is right next to Fort Worth. So they moved my grandfather down. But my dad, my uncle, and my aunt, their sister, they didn't know about any of the options either. And they reached into their savings, reached into their retirement to help pay for care because they didn't know what else was there. So, private pay is great if you've got it. And some of the other options, my favorite option is long-term care insurance. Long-term care insurance would have helped my mother. Cost of care is different everywhere. There's Genworth. I don't know if it's still available. They have an app you can get on your phone just to look and see. And if you really want to give yourself a heart attack, you can project what it'll be in, 15,
don't do
years.
that. Yeah. Yep.
Oh my God. We were paying for memory care in here. It was about $7,500 a month. Yep. And thankfully she had inherited some money from my grandfather. So she had the money to pay. But if she would have got that long-term care insurance, she wouldn't have had to spend it.
I know that you're not an insurance salesperson, but I want to just see your thoughts on this. I literally have this conversation with clients probably every month. They have a long-term care insurance policy they purchased 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They just got their letter from the carrier saying, rates are going up 33% this year, 33% next year, 33% the year after that. So they're looking at a 100% increase. I've seen it so many times. I try to explain to them that's because the cost of care is higher than they anticipated and you're living longer and they didn't really plan it well. So maybe you should keep it. So what do you recommend in that case?
It's hard because like my parents, it was only $200, but, they couldn't afford it. I think to the extent that If you could make it at all possible, then I would, keep it. And there's new stuff, as you know, I'm sure that there's new stuff out there. So when I use the term long-term care insurance, I'm talking about all of it, but I know, like, from your perspective, that's a term of art. That means a very particular product, which may not be available anymore because, like you mentioned, that they didn't really accurately predict the demand for it and the costs that it would be. So there's a lot of people in policies that the rates are going up because of it. But the newer stuff out there, the hybrid stuff that's based on whole life insurance policies or annuities or stuff like that, I think are great. To the extent that if maybe the cost is too high, then if it's possible to maybe lower the payout, so maybe you don't need it to pay the full cost of care. Maybe your income is high enough that you just need it to pay, maybe half. At least from my perspective, don't get rid of it.
Yeah, no, I think it's reasonable. I think that's the one insurance that I don't know the statistic, but it's like 50% of the people that have it use it.
Yeah, I don't know the statistic either, but there's a real good chance you're going to get sick and need some sort of care. I have some people under the traditional policies. It was use it or lose it. So if you got through the end of your life and you never needed it, well, some people, I paid all this money to need it. It's like, you have homeowners insurance. You're not upset that your house didn't burn down last year, right? It's not like it's wasted money, but
there are policies that exist, and I'm not an insurance salesman either, but I understand how they work. There are policies that you can have riders that sort of return a premium.
Exactly.
So you lose your inflation benefit, but you get your money back, kind of thing. That's
Some of the newer stuff, absolutely, and I think that's really helping get a lot of people over that mental hump. Is okay. Well, if I don't use it, at least I haven't wasted that money.
Can you talk about? I've heard a lot of people in elder care talk about ways of sort of protecting our assets or organizing our estates before the issues come up to really benefit us and maybe give us access to other funding.
Yeah. So that leads to the third way to pay for care, and that's government benefits. There's two primary benefits. There's Medicaid and then there's VA benefits. A lot of people think Medicare covers it, and it really is very, very limited. It's basically up to 100 days, and it's more of like a rehab if you break your ankle or something like that. But Medicaid is, a lot of people think it's for poor people. And it's really how the middle class pays for care in the United States. It does have some limitations and some things. Different states have different rules, but basically, if you have too much money, you can't get qualified. That's both income, if you have too much income and have too much assets. And so one of the things that you can do is find an elder law attorney in your area, and they can help walk you through the requirements of Medicaid in your state. And a lot of people think, I don't want Medicaid. That means it's a terrible nursing home. And that's really not the case necessarily. The fact that a nursing home accepts Medicaid or not doesn't mean it's a bad nursing home. It just means they've decided as a business decision to take Medicaid.
Can I ask one quick question? When you say nursing home, that fits in all the homes. It could be assisted living. It could be memory care. It could be any of these things, right? But
yeah, that's a great question. Actually, no.
No. Okay.
No. Some states do have some benefits that will help pay for assisted living. New York comes to mind, that they have a lot of really good care. But most states, it's a full-on nursing home benefit for Medicaid. Texas, for example, they do have a limited Medicaid benefit, but it's not huge unless you're in a nursing home. Really, the best way to plan for that is talking with the elder law attorney, and they can help you pre-plan. So and I think most states, you can do a special Medicaid qualifying trust, Medicaid irrevocable trust. So it's a trust that you do ideally 5 years before you need it. And that way that you can't get penalized for giving any money away recently. You have it. It is available to you in an indirect way so that you can still benefit from it.
And that's 5 years before you need the money for care.
Yeah. Now, California, I understand, has some different rules, and you may not need it in California, but I also understand the rules are changing, but the rules have been changing. So how to find an elder law attorney? There's a group called National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, NALA. They have a list of attorneys. You do have to be careful, because just because you're a member of that doesn't mean they actually do it on a regular basis. Some people are just interested in it, so they become a member. But somebody who's got experience doing pre-planning is awesome.
What are some of the biggest mistakes you see that people make?
Oh my gosh. I have a client who we were trying to get Medicaid benefits for, who a year ago cashed out his IRA and put it in gold. Actually bought gold with it. And the reason why that's a problem, every state's different. In Texas, an IRA is not a countable asset if it's kicking off RMDs, required minimum distributions. And if it isn't, if they're not old enough to get that yet, there's another way we can get it not countable. So basically, we take it off the table entirely. So by doing that, he took a non-countable asset and made it countable, in which case, because of how we now have to get him qualified, basically we're going to take half of that money and we're going to spend it on his care. We are going to be able to still protect half of it, but we can't protect the whole thing like we could if he hadn't touched it.
Also, from a financial planning perspective, you can actually own gold inside your IRA and not pay the taxes to pull money out of your IRA. So there's like a double whammy there. Like, I don't know what he's thinking.
Yeah,
anyway, I hope he doesn't hear this.
Well, no, he's not going to hear this. But to me, that's one of the reasons why I do things like this, is I really want to educate people. Yeah. Because in my family, nobody talked to them about what's there. How can you get hurt? What are the different options that you have? And so my grandfather just spent his life savings paying for my grandmother's care. He didn't know. This gentleman, he didn't know.
I mean, if you're in the situation where your parents need care, they don't have money or assets, you don't know how to access, money or assets for them. Do you go to the state controller? Where do you go to find information to see how I get support to help my parents? So I'm not paying. I don't need to.
Yeah, I think probably the best way, honestly, is an elder law attorney, because they know the programs and the things that are available. It's confusing. I remember actually when I was in law school, we were looking at benefits from my mother's father, so my maternal grandfather. And they were asking me about things like Miller Trust. And I'm like, I don't have any. I mean, same last name as me, but I don't have any idea what it was, because I was still in law school. In fact, it would have been till 5 or 6 years afterwards that we even had an inkling what that is. I talked a little bit about Medicaid. Another potential benefit is for veterans. We colloquially call it aid and attendance. It can actually help pay for assisted living and memory care, at-home care. It's not a huge benefit. I forget exactly how much it is. I want to say you can get anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 a month, which can be great. It just doesn't go for nursing home very far. But that's just a benefit that not very many people know about. The reason why I bring that up now is there are some people who call themselves veterans benefits consultants who basically do things that make them a lot of money.
Yeah.
And don't really help the veteran as much. So
I have a client who discovered that they have money, they're doing well. He had a stroke, it's tragic, because then everything goes sideways in their lives. But was a veteran, and they went to Veterans Administration and they found this benefit, and it was huge difference for the family. Gigantic benefit. So go to elder law attorneys if you have questions locally. If you're in Texas, go to Aaron. Do you practice in other states or just Texas?
I'm actually technically licensed in New Mexico. Just got that a couple of years ago, but mainly Texas. There's actually, I'm impressed that your person talked to the VA and somebody actually told them about it, because the VA is probably one of the largest bureaucracies that's ever been in existence, and they don't, this person doesn't know they don't know all the benefits, and so
his wife did the research and dug and found it. Yeah.
And now you say that, you do have to be careful. VA is a national program, so that's okay. Each state has different rules on Medicaid. So if you're doing research, looking something up in California doesn't necessarily apply here in Texas, and vice versa. So, you just got to be real careful with where you get your information.
Don't just Google it. Talk to the elder law attorney in your state.
Well, yeah, and I know that's a little self-serving, but it's really the best way to get the right information, particularly if you got somebody that knows what they're doing.
Yeah. So there's an enormous amount of noise out there. I ask pretty much every guest to simplify it for us. If you're working with a young couple, you said this earlier, like you like working with young kids. They got a new baby, their parents are still alive, and they haven't done any planning between them. What's the first thing they should do? Should they do their own estate, or should they work with their parents on elder planning, or what's the first thing they should take care of?
All things being equal, like we're not talking about, mom needs care today, right? When you go on an airplane, they tell you if the mask comes down, you put your mask on yourself before you help the others around you. I think probably if you're a young couple, get your estate planning done. And then we can go and get mom. But now, if I say nursing home, but also if we've got a diagnosis of dementia or something where we have to move very, very quickly, things would change. But I think get your own stuff first, and then let's talk about,
Do you ever actually do like have mom and dad and son and wife and their baby in the room together and do the whole thing? Do you do like the whole package for the family? Have you ever done that?
We don't usually do them all together. We could. Usually
Yeah.
there's at least there's some potential conflicts there. But we have had, usually it's where mom and dad will buy it for their kids. And, we have to explain, that's great, but the kids are going to be my clients. So if they cut you out, then, it's definitely common to either do it that way, or sometimes we'll have the kids come in and they'll go, okay, we got to get you in front of mom and dad.
Just for a wrap up, I like to come back to personal. If you listen to a podcast, you know that this is coming. If you haven't, then you don't. So there we go. What was the last thing you changed your mind about?
That is a good question. I don't know. I don't know if this is the last thing, but the biggest thing I changed my mind about, at least professionally, is wills versus trusts. So a will is a document that says who gets your stuff after you pass away. To be effective, it has to go through the probate process.
Yep.
A trust is a legal agreement between three parties. Typically, mom and dad are going to be all three of those parties: the grantor, the person that creates the trust; the trustee, the person that runs the trust; and the beneficiary, that's the person that the trust is created for. To a certain extent, I still believe this, but I don't really care if you get a will or a trust, depending on what your goals are. But what I've found is people who buy a will think they're buying a trust. And what I mean by that is they think they are avoiding the probate process. And if they understand completely that they're avoiding the probate process, the kids may not. So I've had this conversation. Mom and dad had a will. Why are we talking about probate? And unfortunately, it's a thing that people forget. And real quick, I'll tell you this story. I had a client who called me. Mom had just gotten a call from the title company. And the title company realized they were getting ready to sell the house. They were closing on Friday. And her husband was on the title to the property. Well, he died about 10 years earlier. And so what happens is you have to probate a will within a certain period of time. In Texas, it's 4 years. Otherwise, you get treated as if you're not having a will. And in Texas, what that meant was half of that sale of the proceeds was going to go to his kids because his kids was from a previous relationship. They weren't her kids. And the kicker was he had a will and it completely cut out his kid. Everything goes to the wife. And she's like, I've got a will. Why is this kid going to get half my money? Because she didn't probate it. And so I'm much more in favor of a trust now than I was before because it just makes life easier for the family.
I think in California, it's courts, but it's not the criminal court.
There's probably a separate court for it. Yeah.
I don't remember the name of the court, but it is so backed up in California. We say do the trust to avoid that because you have no idea when they're going to see you.
And it's a lot more expensive. Yeah. One more real story real quick. My wife's grandmother lived in California, had a trust.
Yep.
But she had some technology stock that for some reason didn't get put in the trust. So if you have a trust, it's really important you get it funded. Technology stock was, up here when she died. I don't know the exact numbers. I want to say it was worth like $300 a share. Takes 3 years to go through the probate process. It drops to about $3 a share. And my father-in-law said, yeah, there was about enough money to pay the lawyers at the end of it. And that was it. So you have a trust, make sure it gets funded. But definitely if you're in California, you need to have a trust because it's a lot and takes a lot of time.
Takes a long time. Aaron, I want to say thank you very much for coming on. We're going to make everything in the show notes. How do people find you? If they have information, questions, where do they find you?
Yeah, they can go to our website, aaronmillerlaw.com, AARONMILLERLAW.com.
And if someone was to reach out to you and they're from the state of California or the state of whatever, Minnesota, can you point them to resources?
Oh, absolutely. So I know attorneys probably in just about every state. Plus, they can also go to the NALA website, National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys website, and there'll be a list of attorneys there too. Yeah, but we can definitely help.
Aaron, thanks so much for coming on. Very much appreciate the information, and thanks for educating us about elder law. Very much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at mindful.money. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/mindfulmoney. We'll be sure to read those out on future episodes.